And welcome everybody back to the Mind Sculptors. I am your host, Callahan, and still with me is my good friends Cobblepott and Pongo. And splitting this one up into a couple because we got through
6 cards in an hour and a half.
Yeah, we got through Hull Breacher and Opposition Agent, and I looked at the time on the record, and it was 40 minutes. So I was like, we might need to break this up a little bit.
Sure.
But of course, welcome back, you guys.
Still here.
And
Still good to be here,
yeah. So we spent a lot of time talking about partners, and I have a lot of thoughts about this card. I'm really excited about this card. It is a Planeswalker this time that can partner with any partner. Is Jeska Thrice Reborn. It's 2 colorless in a red. Legendary Planeswalker. Jeska enters the battlefield with a loyalty counter on it for each time you've cast a commander from the command zone this game. Not specifically her, a commander. She has 2 abilities. One is a 0, a 0 activation. Choose target creature until your next turn. If that creature would deal combat damage to one of your opponents, it deals triple that damage to that player instead. Then it has a -X ability, where Jeska deals X damage to each of up to 3 targets. So there's a lot to unpack here. My first favorite thing about this, and before I toss it over to Cobblepott, is going to be the fact that I can go turn 1, Serra Ascendant, turn 2, Jeska, 0 on the Serra Ascendant, and deal 18 damage lifelink on turn 2. I think that is fun. I like turning creatures sideways. So I saw this card and I was immediately like, maybe I can build some sort of aggro list with this card. That's probably very optimistic of me. But I'm always trying to find how can I just throw creatures on the board, turn them sideways, and do it well. So Cobblepot, I know you have some thoughts. What's really going on with this thing?
So I think that the first thing that people are drawn to when they see this is the fact that it's an infinite mana outlet. So right. If you get infinite red mana, then you can cast it and then do its -X for however many it's got and bolt people to the face and then recast it and then just continue doing that. So you pair it up into whatever color spectrum you want, and either you do some sort of a dockside loop to create your infinite mana, or people who are pairing it up with Tymna, for instance, and Mardu. I've seen people using World Gorger loops to go infinite mana. The way to get to infinite mana, it varies from list to list, but in every case, they want to get to infinite mana, so they're going to use Jeska as their finisher. And I mean, like you were just saying with your Serra Ascendant, this is really good for Mardu Turbo Naz, because having solvency of life is key for successful Naz games. So if you can have your Tymna come down and then swing at somebody and you can gain 6 life off of that is maybe 5+ more cards that you get to see when you resolve your Naz. So this also, like we have been saying, this fits well with Silas. So for the people who want to just take your standard Grixis approach to this and have an infinite mana outlet in their command zone to be able to take advantage of it. I haven't looked at this card a lot, just because my focus has been on some of maybe the spicier cards that we've already been kind of talking about. But I know that there are people who are working on this in different ways.
Me. I am people. One of the cards that I think pairs really well with this and is worth exploring to some extent, especially if you're going to be in some sort of Grixis pairing, and it might not be the most optimal play, but I think it has some value if you get into grindy sort of situations, is Chandra Acolyte of Flame. Because, you know, her 0 not only puts a counter on each red planeswalker that you have, but her minus also lets you cast an instant or sorcery with CMC 3 or less out of your graveyard. So it's a little bit of a versatile card that can let you use Jessica to maybe pick off dorks or something like that, be a little bit more grindy. And that might not be something you put into a stock list, but that certainly is something where I could see an argument being made for why you would want to play that in a particular meta that is very dork heavy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think something that gets overlooked a little bit because people automatically just think of the combo potential of the card is the fact that you can just play this as a 3-mana way to essentially like set people way back on tempo. You get this down on turn 2 against like 3 green decks that led with turn 1 mana dork, and you just say, okay, well, 3 mana, I will essentially like triple time walk. That's pretty strong.
Right.
So
and
that's
only
like,
to -1 it too.
Right. So the thing is, at that point, probably it's coming down with 1 loyalty if it's like on a turn 2. I mean, obviously, who knows? You know, you could have cast your Tymna or whatever beforehand. But yeah, I mean, there's like sort of like fair applications of this card that are incredibly powerful. You know, you even pointed out the combat damage aspect. It's an incredibly powerful card just in terms of its abilities. The last thing I'll say about it is that I really appreciate the design of this card. The fact that it's not impossible, but like very hard to and not incredibly profitable to play this in any other format that's not Commander. Because the vast majority of the time, if you're not playing Commander, there's no way to play this without it coming into play and then leaving play right away.
Right.
So, you know, that triple
abilities, man.
That triple combat damage ability that it has would be a menace in other formats. And, you know, for us, it's powerful, but it's not game breaking because of our 40 starting life total.
And I think one of the things I like before we move on to the next card, which is, again, another partner, is I really like bringing in Planeswalkers as not only your commander, but also to be in the partner slot, because it really opens up different avenues for deck design. Because especially with these Planeswalkers in your command zone, like I mean, a great example is I'm kind of thinking around the way I build Teferi, for instance, right? A little bit differently than I would think about, or even Jace, a little bit differently than I would think about playing like Baral or other things in those colors, just because of the abilities that are attached to it. So with this, the type of permanent it is, I think, first of all, it's very flavorful. Second of all, it just adds a lot of different avenues and a lot of different ideas for play design. I just love the design of this card up and down. Going into the next piece here, the next partner. We've talked about so many of them over the course of this night. But the next one is one that I have brought up a couple of times, one that I'm very excited about personally, is Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. We've got another, can cast it off of a Jeweled Lotus card, 2 colorless and a blue. Legendary Siren Pirate, it's a 2/2. Has flying, and whenever one or more pirates you control deals damage to your opponents, you create a treasure token for each opponent dealt damage. So this is in a way a Tymna for treasure. So instead of drawing cards, you make treasure. There is a lot of different ways you can go with this. But Pongo, there's a 2-card combo with this. And everybody's been kind of talking about it. So what's going on with this card?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting card. A lot of people are, you know, thinking about it for, you know, Grixis shells or even Teamer shells where, you know, you're still going to have creature tutors to combo with, you know, this particular pirate that we got, I think, in M20. Glinthorn Buccaneer. And basically the idea here is that Glinthorn Buccaneer says whenever you discard a card, Glinthorn Buccaneer deals 1 damage to each opponent. It also has an activated ability where for 1 and a red, you discard a card and draw a card. So you're essentially card neutral. And you can only activate that ability if Glinthorn Buccaneer is attacking. So the card has haste, importantly. And what you can do with this card is, you attack with Malcolm and with this. You create treasures, and you can use that to pay for the ability. At which point, Glinthorn Buccaneer deals damage to each of your opponents. And from there, you're making 3 treasures because one of your pirates has dealt damage to each of your opponents. And so you can keep doing this, spending 2 mana each time to discard a card and draw a card. Dealing 1 damage because of the discard, making treasures, so netting mana, and essentially killing your opponents because you only have to do this 40 or so times. So yeah, 1-card combo in Grixis is something that we haven't really seen all that much of before. And same thing, same thing I guess in Temur as well. So what that ultimately ends up meaning is that while it's not necessarily going to replace other options in Grixis, just having access to a 1-card win condition gives you a reason to play this partner, Malcolm, and then you're just leaning on red for color identity reasons for Glinthorn Buccaneer, and then black for tutors, and other options like Adnaz and stuff like that. You have this 1-card combo potential. And essentially, you have the typical game plans that will either be in Temur or Grixis, but you have something that closes the game efficiently and easily, whereas those other decks sometimes would struggle with that point.
I think it's really interesting that they chose to template this as deals the same way that Curiosity and Keen Sense are templated, where it's looking for damage dealt, not combat damage dealt.
Right.
Given the trajectory of Wizards' design of late, most of the time these types of abilities have been on combat damage being dealt. So the fact that this is on damage being dealt is, we love this, and I don't know if this was an intentional choice that they were making because somebody in R&D saw the Glinthorn interaction there, or what it was that they were trying to accomplish, because it makes me want to look at what other pirates are there that can deal damage outside of the combat step, and what other ways do we have to exploit those.
Yeah, and the curiosity point that you brought up is a very good one, because obviously if you're going into Grixis, this is a mono blue commander, so you're going to need Vial Smasher to get that color combination, and Vial Smasher famously already has pretty powerful synergies with those curiosity effects, which also themselves have pretty strong synergy with the Glinthorn Buccaneer and your commander. So there's definitely a lot of elegance to that package if that's the direction you want to take the deck in. Alternatively, you kind of can just go in more of like a Turbo Naz direction once again and just have access to a 1-card win condition, which I think is perfectly powerful and makes the commander pairing very justifiable among Grixis options.
Agreed.
Yeah, and one thing that I've also brought up is you can put this with Tymna as well, and you have a lot of room to do, as we've mentioned before, probably better with Sakashima, but certainly there is room to explore with Malcolm in sort of a Esper Hate Bears kind of list. So we'll see where that goes as far as that is concerned, but this is definitely one to keep an eye out on. Cobblepott, you kind of have been around with the Curiosity control lists, right? Could there be an argument to be made for a Malcolm Vial Smasher Curiosity control list?
Probably, for sure. Just for the same reasons that we are that we've been outlining here. The axis that the curiosity control lists have been most playing on is having a lot of red sweeper effects to keep dorks off the table and that kind of thing, which doesn't work too well with Malcolm, because Malcolm's a 2/2. So that it was kind of taking advantage of the fact that most of your threats had 3 toughness to be able to survive pyroclasms and so on and so forth. So that there's a tension there. But I mean, going maybe not necessarily curiosity control, but more on curiosity combo, I can absolutely see that in Grixis for sure.
Awesome. Speaking of Grixis, we've got this was a card that Nathan Jones brought up on the episode we did together. Is another legendary card. This one does not have partner. Obeka Brute Chronologists. It is 1 colorless, a blue, a black, and a red. Legendary Ogre Wizard. The art has some strong punk pop or punk rock vibes to it, which I'm super into. But she is a 3/4, and she has an activated ability. You tap her, and the player whose turn it is may end the turn. And so what that means is this is like a Sundial of the Infinite sort of scenario. I got the card name right? I'm not thinking of a different card. Okay. You exile all spells and abilities from the stack. The player whose turn it is discards down to hand size, damage wears off, and this turn and until end of turn effects end. Oh, there's so much with this card. It's such a goofy card. So Cobblepott, with this list, what are some of the things that people are really kind of looking at to build around this? Because there's something here, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the core thing that you're going to do is the same sorts of things that you could do if you had Sundial of the Infinite in your command zone. Basically, is you want to use the really cheap red extra turn spells that have negative consequences. If you get to the end of a turn, being able to just shut off those consequences. And basically, the way that you kind of work that out in perpetuity is by using Underworld Breach or by using Isochron Scepter. So with Isochron Scepter, Final Fortune is the only one of those that's an instant. But you can put that on Isochron Scepter and say, I'm going to take another turn, and then when that extra turn comes around, you still have your Isochron Scepter to be able to do it again for the next turn, and you just end the turn before you get the lose the game clause. The same thing will work with Underworld Breach, in that instead of using a Scepter to replay that again and again, you just keep your Underworld Breach in play, because you just move to the next turn, and you at the end of turn you don't lose the game, and you don't have to sacrifice the breach. So you're able to kind of continue that as long as you're able to continue to put cards into your graveyard. You'll be able to continue casting those spells again and again and again. So you're doing Grixis things. I mean, people want to be on they want to be on breach lines in the first place anyway. You're probably still going to be playing ad nauseam. You're going to be doing the things you expect to do in Grixis. It's just got some different kind of characteristics to it that you don't normally see with kind of the Final Fortune sort of the suicide extra turn spells. But another dimension here too. This is the first time that you've had a Sundial ability that you're able to activate outside of your own turn. That's the main condition that you see on Sundial, is that you can only activate that on your turn. This is a very permissive and political ability to, I think, reduce the strength of opposing Nas, because I mean, there are a lot of Nas decks that want to posture themselves to be able to do a main phase Nas profitably, but still, I mean, prevailing wisdom is your best Naz is going to be at the end step of your last opponent. And with Obeka in play, as long as it's somebody else's turn, you can, collaborate with somebody else to say, would you like to end your turn now so that this Naz gets exiled and goes away? And that's going to be a powerful deterrent for people trying to do end phase Nazes. Right. So that's going to be a significant impact in games where ad Naz is proliferant.
This is also a viable way to, if somebody flashes in opposition agent in response to a tutor, you can just activate this and nobody tutors.
Right. And what's important here is that the spells are exiled from the stack,
right.
Which means that while the card is a spell, it is subject to that as well. So in that particular case, the opposition agent is exiled and not able to be retrieved, and that is a strong deterrent from people trying to keep you off of your tutors. So as long as you're doing your tutors on your turn.
Man, where was this when Flash was around? This would have been great against Flash.
Please do not unban Flash on account of
please don't. But so we got that, and then Pongo, I know, so when Battle Bond came out, right, they did these bond lands, as they're called, and they did, I believe it was the enemy bond lands. Now they're doing, maybe I'm wrong, no, now they're doing the enemy bond lands.
It was the allied bond lands.
It was allied
first.
originally.
Right.
Yeah.
So now they're doing the enemy bond lands. So we've got Training Center. I don't know what all the names are. So what does this really open up for mana bases?
So one thing that's important to consider is, mana bases in cEDH are absurdly good. They've always been essentially perfect, particularly in like 3, 4, 5 color decks. So for a lot of the top decks in the format, this is going to be kind of an incremental sort of upgrade. One thing that does stand out to me is the fact that if you're playing sort of like some of the Turbo Naz type strategies, you now have more pain-free lands, which is always nice to have. Right. Ultimately you still want to be playing a certain number of fetchable lands, whether it's original duels or shocks, because obviously fetch lands are still the best lands in the game.
Right.
I personally in Najeela am considering playing the green-blue land over Waterlogged Grove, because I don't remember the last time I actually drew a card with my Waterlogged Grove, but I am playing Adnaz in that deck, so if I can save like 2-3 life, that could theoretically be relevant. It seems like it would be relevant more often than, like I said, the 0 times in recent memory that I've drawn a card. So again, very incremental sort of upgrade. Looking beyond that, this is really nice to have for lower color decks. Having another blue-red land for blue-red decks, and blue-green decks, having an extra blue-green land is super nice. Those are the decks where, you don't necessarily have the most stringent mana requirements, but having perfect mana and even better mana is pretty nice. So I do see these seeing a ton of play. Notably, these also make it a little bit easier to play, low color Hermit Druid mana bases, low color Tainted Pact mana bases. I think that might be the most significant benefit that these bring to the format. Right. I think that there's a strong pull to be playing more colors if you're playing those types of strategies, but it's always nice to see that they're going to become more viable.
Right. Then we'll have the snow-covered bond lands, which will make it even easier to run.
Right.
Tainted Pact mana base.
Yeah. New lands, like, they're always cool, but we're getting to the point of like critical mass of good lands where they're not necessarily the most exciting thing anymore, unless of course they happen to be like spells on one side. That's kind of cool. That's a different story.
I love those cards so much. I deeply love those cards so much. Those made Lavinia so much better. I mean, because now it's just like you get into a lock and you're just like, hey, I have this thing that will be under there sometimes and it wins me the game. And for the 99% that it's not under there, it is a land. And it's great.
I think...
go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think another thing that I particularly like about these lands that, again, I would be remiss not to mention is these help a lot with budget mana bases. And that is probably my favorite part about these lands.
Right. I mean, they help with budget mana bases for now. If the original bond lands are any indication, their price are only going to go up. So for the now, they're very accessible and attainable. And
the good news is if you listened to my episode with Dan Schmidt a couple episodes ago where we were talking about the LGS, we touched on why Commander Legends got pushed back, and it was specifically to avoid the Jumpstart Battle Bond issue of the demand was much higher than the amount of product that was out there. So hopefully we can avoid that. But I know with Battle Bond and Jumpstart, there was this huge demand for this product. And there were like, I made a joke on there. I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's more boxes of Portal 3 Kingdoms floating around there than there are of Jumpstart right now.
Right, in English.
Yeah. I'm still not convinced that Jumpstart even exists, to be quite honest with you.
I've never seen a real-life Jumpstart box or pack ever.
Yeah.
So
I have seen them and went, oh, I don't need to buy any packs. I'll just buy the singles. And then I looked at the price of like Allosaur, Shepherd, and a meal, and I was like, okay, maybe I'm not. So as we look on, we're not talking about a land this time. We're not talking about a legendary, although we will get back to that. We've got a very interesting card. We've talked a lot about wheels in this episode. Well, I think in the last episode, but in this episode, this two-parter. So we all know of Wheel of Fortune. We've got what I'm convinced was meant to be an uncard, and somebody sent, just put it in black border. Is Wheel of Misfortune. It's a sorcery for 2 colorless and a red. Each player secretly chooses a number that's 0 or greater. Then all players reveal those numbers simultaneously and determine the highest and lowest numbers revealed this way. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose that number. Each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. So that was a lot. I'm sorry I just read the Lord of the Rings to you guys on this Magic card. So this is obviously a pretty complicated Magic card. As a judge, this card is a nightmare because of everybody secretly chooses a number, and then you all reveal them at the same time. This is, if I was running a tournament and this card shows up, I would hate every judge call that was made that day, because it will end up being the same person who's playing this card, and I'm gonna roll my eyes every time because it's gonna be, I don't think this person actually picked that number. But Pongo, just break this card down for me.
Oh, you had to pick me. I mean, listen, so I'm gonna preface this by saying I'm not John Nash. I'm not an economist or a mathematician, and this card, quite frankly, we're getting to a level of complexity or intrigue where you might benefit by having some familiarity with game theory and some of those ideas. So on the surface, this is a card that is essentially quite similar to Wheel of Fortune, and it also bears a striking or a passing similarity to like Punisher type effects, which, if you're not familiar with them, are cards like temporal extortion, which basically give your opponent a choice of punishments. And one of them is either, you know, some kind of beneficial spell effect. So in the case of temporal extortion, they take an extra turn, or, you know, you can pick your poison and you can choose to lose. I think it's like 10 life instead, or 5 or 10 life. I think 10. So in 1v1, if you were to play this card, it would actually probably play out somewhat similarly to that, where if your opponent does not want you to wheel, they just have to pick some kind of high life total, and they'll win, right? Most likely you're not going to want to wheel and spend more than 10 life to prevent the wheel from happening, or to guarantee get your wheel. But in multiplayer, this becomes substantially more complex, because we run into this question of, well, first of all, it's only the person who has the lowest number who doesn't wheel and who doesn't lose life.
Point of clarification, only the person who picked the highest number loses life. Everybody else.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, everyone else who's in the middle will wheel but not lose life.
Right.
And if multiple people pick the same number and it's the highest number, they all lose the life.
Right. That's why they had to word it that way.
Exactly. So, you know, you have like in multiplayer kind of like two axes of potential punishment, and also, you know, potential choices to make. You know, do you want to wheel? And if so, you know, how much life are you willing to spend to sort of like, you know, make sure that you're wheeling, and that you're not going to be the person who pays the least amount of life. Alternatively, is there any way to collude to make sure that, you know, the person who needs the wheel the most doesn't get their wheel? You know, in theory, you can imagine somebody dumps their entire hand on turn 1, you know, before anyone else has managed to play the game, and then puts Wheel of Misfortune on the stack and, you know, has every intention of wheeling. But, you know, his 3 opponents are like, well, we just like, you know, mulligan to these 7-card hands. We don't want to have our hands disrupted. We don't want to wheel right now because, you know, maybe you have the nuts. We talk about it amongst ourselves and we say, okay, well, we're all going to pay 25 life, right? And the person who wants to wheel, you know, maybe they're playing an Adnos deck, and the prospect of paying 25 life or 26 life or whatever to guarantee get their wheel is not super, super appealing. You know, they don't want to be the person who paid the lowest. So there's that aspect. And again, I don't want to get into that too much. I don't know that that's going to be a reasonable scenario in a lot of cases. But beyond that, even in that discussion, you're going to run into this issue where, you know, even if everyone colludes and says, oh yeah, let's all pay 25 life, there's someone who wants to pay 24 life. And there's someone who wants to pay, you know, choose to 23 and not actually pay the life, right? You know, you always have this like desire to not actually cooperate with everybody and all lose the life together. So you're constantly getting pushed downward to make sure that you're not actually going to be the person with the highest, even if you've all colluded and agreed to name a number higher than the number that the person who's choosing to wheel or who really, really wants to wheel is going to name, presumably. So, you know, it kind of boggles the mind when you think about potential counterplay to this card, you know, the potential for people not wanting to wheel, as well as the potential for people not wanting to lose life. You know, there's all these sort of permutations of possibilities that occur. In actuality, what I expect to see happen is people are not going to pay that much life. It's going to be a Wheel of Fortune, and maybe you wheel a fortune and lose 5 life or something. Like, I think that's probably the most common play pattern. That being said, it's not strictly wheel, because, you know, you will occasionally run into these situations where people will discuss, what are we doing now? And things will get messy.
Right. Now, one thing with this card that I do think is interesting, because on the collusion point, in a casual game of EDH, that will definitely, even a casually competitive game of EDH, that's certainly something that will come about. When you start to delve into, because I run a lot of sanctioned cEDH events in at my LGS, if there was a situation like this that you're describing, right, where everybody decides we're going to choose 25, the player who's casting that Wheel of Fortune can very rightfully call a judge and get you on some form of cheating for misresolving the spell, because it does require the table to resolve the spell, and that is on the onus of everybody at the table to correctly resolve the spell. And if they're knowingly misresolving the spell, that would be a problem.
Well, so what you're saying maybe applies as the spell is resolving, but I think you can have this discussion with the spell still on the stack.
Right. My understanding
Right.
was that you can declare to people what you intend,
Right.
and then go back on what your declaration was with whatever it is you wrote on a piece of paper upside down or something.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, and I bring that up specifically for that point, where I do think the order of how you would approach that matters, because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where if you are at, let's say you're at Oktoberfest or something like that, right, and you're playing in that event, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you get a judge call on you for, cheating. So that is, and that was my immediately thought when I saw this, was some red flags with the possibility of cheating on it. And maybe that's just because I've run a lot of events and had to, give players warnings and things of that nature, that I'm a little cautious with this sort of game design. But it is certainly something that if you're going to do exactly what Pongo is saying, and the way that you're describing it is before the resolution of the spell, I think that's reasonable, and I don't think that many judges would say much about it. If it's as the spell is resolving, that would be a problem.
Right. I'm just gonna, I guess, conclude and then let Cobble take it away from here. But my last thought on this card is that it's the most intriguing card design I've seen, I think, since the Gitrog monster.
I would concur that it's definitely an interesting card. I mean, it's a very confusing card. It makes me think of a silver bordered card called Ambiguity that has to do with spells that have counters and spells that counter, and it does different things. But where you have to read it a couple of times because it's like, wait a minute, so wait, who actually draws? And you have to go back and read it again, even though you read it once. I hear all the things that you're saying about the game theory that goes on there, and what I think is, especially in cEDH, you've got a lot of people who are devoting a lot of resources to sculpting a hand into a very specific shape that they want for being able to combo out. And historically, wheel effects have been extremely disruptive to people, absolutely off of their mulligans. But I mean, a couple of turns into the game, having a wheel can be hugely disruptive to the player who's, got their win apparatus in hand and they're just waiting for their turn. Oh man, I would have won if you hadn't have done that wheel, whatever. I think what's going to happen is a lot of the time there's going to be at least one person at the table that does not want to participate and is going to pick 0 because they want to keep their hand. And when that happens, it really doesn't matter what number you pick. It means if you're picking something non-zero, chances are you're going to be able to participate in that wheel. So the people who want to opt out have a sure thing. If they pick 0, they know that they're not part of the wheel. And I think that that's kind of going to be like the unspoken way that people do it. And if there is kind of game theory that takes place, it's going to be people choosing 1 or whatever to somehow, I don't know if people are going to look at it from the point of view of, okay, this person, has spent all of their resources, they've got no cards in hand, and now they're going to refill. We don't want them to do that. Rather than say, I'm going to pick 25 life so that they don't get to draw. I'm going to say, I'm going to cast Swan Song. And counter the spell, and now they don't get to draw. I think like that is the way people are going to resolve it more often than within the confines of kind of the little sub game that's happening in the card. And
yeah, I agree.
I mean, it remains to be seen, whether it sees play and what happens when it does see play, because we haven't played with the card yet. But I think it's a really thought-provoking design, but I don't know if in real life it's going to be as interesting as we would hope it would be.
I just don't want to have to deal with this as a judge. It's really all it comes down to for me. Is I saw this card and I was like, oh, come on.
Yeah, it's definitely. I don't know if they could have worded it more clearly. I think they could have designed it more clearly so the wording would have been able to follow more concisely.
I think what would have made it more easy to resolve and maybe a little bit more flavorful is each person rolls a six-sided dice. Whoever rolls the lowest keeps their hand, and whoever doesn't, or whoever the highest one is, right? And then you kind of get some randomness to it, which I think is kind of the part that it feels like it's trying to go for, right? Like it's a Rakdos, clearly in the art, like it's Rakdos. Now I'm kind of talking about like, all of this.
The flavor aspect.
Right.
Yeah.
But even then, I feel like that is easier to resolve than, all right, everybody get a piece of paper, write down your number, and then we'll all flip them over at the same time. All right, go. That just feels like, this just feels like a kitchen table card to me, which is why I feel like it should be silver bordered.
It does feel very silver bordered.
When I say this card, I think was an end card that they just went, make it black.
It works in black border, yeah. Just do it. Although I don't know that I agree with that. I understand that, yes, like because of the mechanical complexity, this could have been a silver border card recently, and it certainly feels like it may have originally been designed like that. But I also see this card as, and the reason why I think they would not have designed it with that randomness aspect that you're discussing is because I think that this is kind of part of a sustained effort on the part of Wizards of the Coast to kind of skirt the reserve list and print cards that, in gameplay situations play similarly to cards on the reserve list without actually violating the spirit of the reserve list.
No, that makes sense. And that's certainly true. I don't know. It just, between the name and the secret part of it, it just, to me, the first thing I saw was, I was like, this feels like it should be silver bordered. But no, I think you're totally right.
It's just an incredibly complex card. And, incredibly complex. And this is like coming from after a time where Wizards, was kind of like trying to reduce complexity for some time. And it seems that Wizards has like not just doubled down, not just tripled down, but like literally quadrupled down on complexity with this card, because this is more complex than the most egregiously complex cards from the time where they were saying, okay, we need to chill with the complexity.
Right. This feels like something that would have been printed in the time of Legends, where they've got like the Bible printed on the card because there's like so much stuff going on. It's like, well, you really could have just done this other way and made it much more concise and much clearer.
I mean, the card that immediately comes to mind, I was about to say this before you even said Legends, is I was about to say, I feel like this is harder to understand than the original wording on Limduel's Vault.
Right, or Chains of Mephistopheles, or Animate Dead.
Like, this is just, like, and it's not worded poorly. It's worded exactly the way it should be. And very, like, it's hard to understand because there's a lot of layers to it, right?
Right.
But it's worded correctly so that it makes sense once you kind of get through all the layers.
And that was the point that I was trying to make, where they've worded it the best they could per the design of what is happening on the card. And I think that they probably could have made the design itself more streamlined so that the wording could have been more clear. But
I have an alternate wording for it that I think would work. each player secretly explains how banding works. Then all players reveal their explanation of how banding works simultaneously.
Then the players vote on who did the best job, and then
the person who did the best job wins the game. Yeah.
You know, and that could have been an interesting, you know, you bring up the vote mechanic. That could have been an interesting thing to bring into this, is like the council's, what was that mechanic that they had?
Yeah.
Will of the council.
Yeah, you could have done something where, you know, everybody votes for one side or the damage side, and it might have brought it down a lot, but it might have added some more later. I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of things they could have done that didn't include secretly choosing a number. I really just been out of shape over the secret part.
Yeah. Anyway,
moving on. And we're going back to the legendary creatures, and we've got a card that doesn't feel like its colors, but is very, very good. Is Arkelos? Did I say that right?
Arkelos. I would say Arkelos.
Okay. Arkelos Lagoon Mystic. He is 4 CMC. He's a colorless black, green, and blue. He's Sultai, a 2/4 turtle shaman that's legendary. And he is effectively a Amulet of Vigor. As long as Arkelos is tapped, other permanents enter the battlefield tapped. As long as Arkelos is untapped, other permanents enter the battlefield untapped. So Cobblepott, you've kind of talked about this card a lot on Twitter, in a lot of different varieties, but you kind of see this as a stacks commander, right?
Right. And so what I would clarify here is that when he's untapped, it's a similar effect to Amulet of Vigor, but it's a very different effect. So Amulet of Vigor is a trigger. So if something would enter the battlefield, if something enters the battlefield tapped, then it triggers and causes an untap. And the reason why that's important is that when you have abilities like Yarok or Panharmonicon or whatever that observe permanents entering the battlefield and then make copies of triggers, that's a way that you can exploit Amulet of Vigor. So you have circumstances like under Yarok where you get Amulet of Vigor, you get to untap things twice. So if you have a Gaia's Cradle come into play tapped, then you get to untap it twice and actually, double the output of the Cradle. In this particular case, it's a replacement effect. So the permanent that would be entering the battlefield tapped comes into play untapped instead. So it can't that surface of exploitation doesn't exist. It's still a very powerful effect for dealing with permanents that cause things to that permanents that would otherwise come into play tapped, like bounce lands, or abilities that put things into play tapped, like Scapeshift or Splendid Reclamation or whatever. So there are game plans where people are looking to use his untapped side basically to exploit those types of effects so that they can make something like a Scapeshift that's intended to be kind of mana neutral and have everything come into play tapped, make them very mana positive instead. So that would be one half of the game plan that's taking place. The other half is he basically becomes an Orb of Dreams when he's tapped, which means that, and he's kind of like a world enchantment here. He impacts the permanents that come into play for all players, not just yourself. So the idea here is you are using your own combat step or your own Earthcraft or whatever means that you have of getting him tapped to break parity with his presence on the board. So on your turn, he untaps, and anything that you want to do, all of your permanents will enter the battlefield untapped. And then before passing turn to your opponents, you find some means of tapping him, either through attacking or using Earthcraft or some other effect. And then all of your opponents are under an Orb of Dreams, which is extremely taxing for fetch lands and for Dockside Extortionist and for everything that you want. That it's an incredible tempo reduction to have everything come into play tapped. And then the expectation is that people would exploit it with Static Orb, Winter Orb, those sorts of effects. Currently, you don't see a lot of Winter Orb. You don't see a lot of Static Orb. You don't see a lot of Blood Moon. And the reason for that is because Dockside Extortionist just rolls right through those effects. Not having being able to only untap one land isn't that much of a problem if you only need 2 lands to get Dockside into play and then be able to generate infinite mana over the top of whatever stacks effects are there. The fact that this guy allows you to tap down lands that are coming into play and nullify the treasures that are coming into play from the Dockside makes Static Orb abilities much, much stronger than they are currently. And I mean, to the point of making them potentially viable. But he's, a 4-mana commander in 3 colors, so he's not coming down turn 1 or turn 2 anytime soon. So whether he's fast enough to be able to exert that power, I think remains to be seen. And I would probably be pessimistic as to whether he's going to be a dominant force in the metagame.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you on that. Although I do think there is some design space with it. Personally, I think the design space is going to be from a cEDH perspective. I really think you're going to end up seeing those like scape shift sort of decks be the way to go, as like a combo deck that has a way to slow down your opponents. I could see this as a reason to play, like, if you were doing something like that, what was the card we were talking about earlier? Springleaf Drum is a very good way of leveraging him, or it, against your opponents, and kind of working for you. So I mean, there's something there. I don't know if it's good or not, but there's certainly something worth exploring somewhat, in my opinion.
He'd be a lot better in ban.
Yeah, actually, I wouldn't mind jumping off from that point.
Yeah.
I actually sort of like came up with a preliminary brew for this deck with Lurker and a few other people, because I think this guy's super cool. Like, I love the flavor. I love the ability. Design-wise, I think it's a bit unfortunate that he doesn't have a triggered ability like an Amulet of Vigor, because that would actually, to me, make him feel like he has more business being in Sultai, because then, you could play him with Yarok, and, you could do some really interesting things that way.
Right.
I understand why they didn't do it. To me, I think the main reason why is it's because the tapped part of the ability is pretty awkward to do any other way other than as a replacement effect, as is currently templated. And then if one ability is a replacement effect and one ability is a triggered ability, it's not really an elegant card design when you can just do it this way. So I get why they did it this way. And yeah, so I agree entirely that one of the bigger issues with this guy is that he is not in banned colors. So what that means is that you don't necessarily have access to a lot of like the strongest stacks pieces that you would really want to be playing if your goal is to play a stacks deck. But another, let's say, more pernicious downside to not being in banned and instead being in Sultai is, like, there's this incredible centralizing force in Sultai of just playing Thassa's Oracle based combos. And so you kind of run into this issue while you're playing this guy of, why am I not just winning with Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation? And if I'm doing that, why aren't I just playing a more proactive deck instead? So he's kind of suffering from his own success in a way, being in very strong colors that don't necessarily want to push you in the direction of exploiting his abilities.
What if we just all collectively rule 0 him as a Bant commander? We fix him ourselves. There we go.
I'll ask Sheldon. We'll see if we can do it.
Yeah.
He'll say, yeah, go for it. If you have a rule 0, it's fine.
So moving on, we got more legendary stuff on the table. This time, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting with this set is all of the 2-mana or the 2-color legendary cards are not partnered. And that felt like it was a very deliberate choice to push partners into a monocolored sort of design area. But one of the 2-colored commanders coming out of the set is Aruyumi of the Dead Tide. It is a colorless blue and a black legendary merfolk wizard. So, Brian from Tolarian Academy should be very happy about that. It's a 1/4, and you can tap it, exile cards from your graveyard equal to the number of opponents you have, target creature, and that's part of the cost. Target creature card in your graveyard gains Encore until end of turn, and the Encore cost is equal to its mana cost. And so for those of you who don't know what Encore is you exile the creature card from your graveyard and pay its mana cost. For each opponent, create a token copy that attacks that opponent this turn if able. They gain haste, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step, activate only as a sorcery. So you can only do Encore as a sorcery. I know Cobblepott, you this was another card you talked about on Twitter too. What are some of the things people are looking to do with this?
I don't know if anyone's really doubled down on trying to find a place for this to have a home, either as the commander or in the 99. It's just the fact that there's a lot of excuse me, a lot of value plays that you can make with this, and a couple of powerful game-winning plays that you can make depending on the game state that you're in. Encore is a activated ability, so it's not a cast spell, which means that it's got a low surface area of interaction. So unless someone has a stifle, you're not going to be able to disrupt an Encored ability, which means that if you're able to, either through a Hermit Druid or some other means, mill yourself out, and you've got Tassa's Oracle in your graveyard, you can give it Encore and pay 2 blue, and without, in an uncounterable way, you can get 3 Oracles onto the battlefield with their that will then all see each other. So you'll have 6 blue pips at least on the battlefield, if that's relevant. Of course, people can still interact with you by exiling, cards with Deathrite Shaman or whatever. But in addition to that specific line, you've got things like Dockside Extortionist, so you get 3 Docksides for 2 red mana, or Spellseeker for 3 mana, getting 3 spells to your hand. At there's a lot of interesting value plays. Are they something that is going to become an archetype? Maybe. You see Kess. Kess kind of has a similar style to this, where it is accruing additional advantage through being able to repeatedly make use of things that it's got in its yard. This is sort of doing that, but it's doing it for creatures, and it's doing them 3 at a time instead of 1 at a time. Whether that's something that will prove good enough is, I think that remains to be seen. But it's something that everything that you have in cEDH, a lot of things that are currently cEDH viable were at one point not cEDH viable. They were rooted in things where people tried something that hadn't been done before, or tried something that people maybe scoffed at, and wound up revealing something that could take root. So this seems to me like one of those cards that maybe it doesn't have everything it needs yet, but maybe eventually will be something around which we can build something that would be viable in the metagame. People just need to play with it.
And one of the things that kind of jumped out in my mind for it was, this actually feels like a card that would have a home in like a Kess Twin list, because that's a deck that's already kind of leveraging sort of these graveyard abilities or something along those lines. And if somebody had, dealt with your Pestermite, this might be a good way to bring it back. Because you have a token of it, you can put a twin on it. You can Kiki-Jiki it. Can you Kiki-Jiki it, actually? I might be wrong.
Kiki-Jiki can only... Right. Kiki-Jiki can only target non-legendaries.
Well, I'm talking about, like, the Pestermite. I couldn't remember if it could do non-token.
Yes, it can.
Okay. And so that...
Tokens are one of the ways that you can use Kiki-Jiki to make copies of lands.
Right.
So...
So, I mean, that to me is the initial thing that I feel like that would be, if I were to immediately think of a place to put it, that would be the place, because that is a creature combo list that runs out of the graveyard. That feels like that would be where that fits to me.
It's possible. It would, obviously be some sort of a deck that has vested interest in playing out of the yard. And I think a Hermit Druid list is probably something that probably doesn't need this, but this could be, if you have some way of maybe, you brain freeze yourself and reveal that you've got a Hermit Druid in your yard, and you've got Arumi, you can then encore the Hermit Druids into play, and they'll have haste, and then you can use them to, mill yourself the rest of the way, and then encore your Oracle into play or something like that.
Sorry, go ahead.
It remains to be seen whether anything that's actually viable will materialize. It's just, it's something that has potential given the right support. Does it have the right support? We don't know, but it's worth taking a look.
Well, and part of the problem with it, I think, is the fact that, in those... you brought up with Hermit Druid, is there's just so many better ways to just bring back a Hermit Druid or a Thassa's Oracle after you Hermit Druid away, right? Like,
sure.
There's so much easier ways of doing it, where this one that don't require mana too, where you can just, what's the card I'm thinking of that I can't...
Dread Return?
Yeah, Dread Return it back. This requires, 2 mana, which isn't a lot, but it can matter. So,
the difference, I clarified about Encore because it's not a spell.
Right.
Dread Return is absolutely a spell that can be countered, whereas Encore cannot, and that's why I was articulating that as a nuance that's important, because for that particular line, that could wind up being a more resilient line of play.
Fair enough. So, I brought up Kiki-Jiki and Kess-Twin. And Kess-Twin, by the way, is one of my favorite cEDH decks. I know it's now moved off of the competitive list. I still love it. I like all of the fringe, older cEDH decks that people are like, that's not any good. And I'm just
Corridor.
I still like it. But we've got a new piece to go with Kiki-Jiki, and that's Portraiser. Finally, not another legendary creature that we've been talking about. It's 3 colorless and 2 red. It's a creature orc pirate, so this would be one of the things that go along with Malcolm. Whenever Portraiser deals combat damage to a player, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there's an additional combat phase. Portraiser can't attack a player it has already attacked this turn. It's also a 4/4. So, Pongo, with this card, obviously, we kind of immediately think Kiki-Jiki.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, that's just about it. I'm not familiar with any other discussion people have had surrounding this card for any other contexts. So it's, it's another Kiki-Jiki bottom, which is to say that, it's a secondary combo piece with Kiki-Jiki. Notably, it seems considerably worse than a lot of the other options that we already have access to. So I don't know that this will actually see really much play at all outside of perhaps mono red, or theoretically low color red decks that want to play Kiki-Jiki, because this does have to deal combat damage to a player for it to work. So notably, you know, unlike other Geeky Jeeky combo pieces where you can just make infinite attackers and then move to combat, this isn't actually getting there unless you're able to connect.
Right.
I wonder about this in Winota, which triggers off of non-humans attacking. And if you are able to get additional combat phases, then just from the attack triggers from the commander in that particular case, there's a lot of advantage that can be accessed. So it's expensive. Most of the time you're not going to... This is not a goblin, so there's not a great way to cheat this into play.
Right.
And it's not a human, so...
Right.
You're not putting it into play off of Winota.
Right.
Right.
If you could, way different story, and I think I would be pretty intrigued to see this in Winota. As is, I hadn't actually considered that, and you know, maybe there is something there, because the extra combat phases, as you pointed out, are, you know, really, really strong when you're essentially, you know, drawing cards and getting mana. If you look at Winota's ability in that context, but this would be nutty if like you just could put it directly into play off of a Winota flip, and could also then start taking extra combat steps with it, because notably it's not an attack trigger, it's a combat damage trigger.
Right.
I think they very intentionally made it not a human.
That's I
wouldn't put it past them.
Looking, I mean, seriously, looking at the other designs, looking at Opposition Agent, looking at
enough.
you know, I mean, come on, make it a human, make it a white human.
We'll
with
get
the
to
most
the white...
red ability imaginable.
Right. Continuing down the red trail, we've talked a lot about red cards in this video, and that's because the red cards in this set are really, really good. One of them, we're back to partners, is Kedis, Emberclaw Familiar. It is a colorless and a red 1/1 legendary elemental wizard that has partner. Whenever a commander you control deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to each other opponent. So again, I kind of throw this one at Pongo. You know, what is the natural thing that people are really thinking of right away?
So I've seen people playing this as basically another sort of like Mardu farm type deck, and like I legitimately mean farm, as opposed to, you know, just like Turbo Nas or you know, like whatever people are calling farm these days. You know, literally you have Tymna, and you know, you're playing sort of this attack, you know, perhaps even like small sacrificable creatures game plan. And so you play Kedis for the color, red, just to be in Mardu, as is typical. And you might throw in, you know, just like the spicy inclusion of a card like Hatred, to like just get people randomly, you know, because if you can just like Hatred people, you know, with your life linking Tymna, you can kind of just deal a massive chunk to everybody, potentially even just take them all out like that. So, you know, it's kind of cute. Certainly an option. I think that, you know, like as a commander agnostic game plan, that type of deck is quite strong. So if you're just going to make, you know, like a couple of inclusions just to have this game plan, and, you know, forego having one commander that, you know, could be theoretically something better, you know, that deck is still going to be totally fine.
Right. I would just want to tack on that. I mean, I could see running this as a partner to Tymna without putting any other special cards in the list at all, and just using it as a Tymna amplifier, where if your Tymna is able to get through on anybody, you're gaining 6 life and drawing 3 cards. And those are exactly the things that a farm deck wants to do. It wants to draw cards, and it wants to be or life positive as much as it can to get the most profit out of its, you know, Nas and, you know, Necropotence if it's running that, and those kinds of things. So I think that, you know, just having it in the command zone is good enough to get great value out of that pairing.
And I think this kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where Things like this kind of encourage variety in decks, where you can get, everything's not, all right, what are we pairing with Tymna? All right, what are we pairing with Thrasios? Like, we kind of can get a little bit, like, we're still doing that, but we're getting more creative with it now, because we have these other things that are interesting and have some good value to them on their own. So, and with this being a Commander Legend set, there's some cards that are really wrapped around. They're color-specific cards that are wrapped around whether or not you control your commander or not. And one of those cards, again a red card, is Jeska's Will. It's a 2 in a red sorcery that says, choose one. If you control a commander as you cast the spell, you may choose both. So you can add red mana for each card in target opponent's hand, and or exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. I was talking to Cobblepott about this card before we went on the stream, or went on to record. And this card, to me, feels like it's just gas. Like, I really think this is really good, and you were talking about this as particularly really good in Kark lists.
Right. Just, so most of the time, especially with kind of this like proliferation of 2 mana partner red commanders or less, even with Roger, you're almost always going to be getting both halves of this card. So, also a lot of times, I mean, in most games of cEDH, there's always at least somebody who's at 7 cards in hand at most points in the game. So for 2 mana, you are getting a ritual that is better than, oh my goodness, there's a 3 mana instant that gives you 5 red mana. What the heck is that
Pyretic
called?
Ritual.
Not Pyretic Ritual. Anyway.
Seething Song? Or...
Seething Song.
Oh,
thank
that's
you.
it.
Yeah,
Okay.
Seething Song. So it's better than Seething Song as far as how much mana it's generating, and it's sort of drawing you 3 cards. In the Krark lists where you've got the possibility of copying that or doubling up on it, or if you're having multiple Krarks, getting the effect and then also having the card come back to your hand so you can do it again. In those particular cases, it's absolutely insane. Outside of a degenerate kind of a Krark copying apparatus, I think it's still a good card. The fact that it's exiling the cards and not putting them in your hand, that is detrimental if you exile a win con or something and you're not.
It's a very
able to
red
act on it.
ability, though.
It's a very red ability. I think for the lists that are willing to accept that liability will love this card, and I think it'll see no play anywhere else.
I'm not sure that I agree with that, actually. I think this card may actually get taken up by a good number of decks that are sort of more on the turbo plan. I mean, in particular, this is guaranteed autoplay, absurdly busted card in Roger, where you always get the ritual and you always get the exile the top 3. Generally as early as turn 1 or turn 2. But additionally, this is surprising a lot of people who are trying it out, where it ends up being like pretty strong as a ritual effect, as we discussed. But exiling those top 3 cards of your library, sure, there is some risk inherent in that, but I don't know that it's risk that's necessarily higher than the risk those decks are already willing to take playing cards like Tainted Pact, Demonic Consultation, sort of non-deterministically sort of trying to go off with wheels and stuff like that. These are not decks for the risk averse. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that this card rather, while it's not going into literally every red deck, is going to see play in a surprising amount of red decks than you might originally think.
Well, I welcome it.
Yeah. I love monocolored decks, and if more of them are good, I am very, very, very much here for it. Over on to yet another legendary. There are so how many legends did they say are in the set? It's like 70 some, right?
Well, 71 new partners.
That's just the partners.
Jesus Christ. So there's a lot of legends, and to be fair, it's a draft set, so you gotta have a lot of legends in order to draft a commander deck. So one of the cards that Cobblepott has brought up and brought to our attention, specifically in stuff around Tatyova, because we know you do a lot of the kind of pioneering work around that list, is Kodama of the East Tree. And Kodama of the East Tree is a 4 colorless, 2 green legendary spirit. That's a 6/6 with partner, which is wild. It has reach. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. So of course the madman himself immediately had a thought bubble in his head and went, I gotta do this with Tatyova, we can take advantage with lands. So explain in some more detail exactly what we're talking with this card.
Right. So the ability that triggers when permanents come into play, the fact that it says equal or lesser is the most important part there. There's a lot of abilities that will restrict things to only be lesser because they don't want you to be able to chain long sequences of free value into play. This is a big thing with white, where something happens to something of one cost and you can do that same thing to something of lesser cost. This is allowing you to do things of equal or lesser. So namely, if you have any ability that puts a land onto the battlefield, then you have an option to put another land directly into play. And the thing about Tatyova that makes this exploitable is that land entering the battlefield is going to also create a draw trigger. So when a land comes into play, you can then look at the top card, draw a card. If it's a land, we'll put that one into play too, and then draw another card. So then a lot of times you have kind of this cap where if you don't have like Azusa or some other effect that is allowing you to have multiple land, extra land drops, that you're not really able to take huge advantage of Tatyova's static ability. The fact that maybe that thing that you drew, so you put a land into play and then you got another land, you put that land into play too, and then you got to draw a card. Now maybe that card that you drew was another land, but you don't have any more land drops. Well, you can maybe tap one of those lands that you put into play to cast, and Llanowar Elves, they come into play. Now you put that other land into play and then draw another card. Right. And so what happens is it allows you to behave as if you have an uncapped number of land drops, presuming you're able to continually have kind of like 1 mana dorks that you're able to convert into additional lands and balance that solvency between the number of cards you have in hand and the lands that you have on the battlefield. And you're able to even exploit that further if you're running some of the hate pieces that are in blue that force people to return lands to their hands. So if you're running Overburden, which is a 2 mana enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, its controller returns a land to their hand. I mean, you play a mana dork, and then you get those 2 triggers. You return the land to your hand, put it right back down onto the battlefield, and then draw a card. So there's a huge number of ways that you can kind of exploit what's happening there. Now, this is a 6 mana permanent, so it's expensive, but Tatyova lists are very able to generate huge amounts of mana. So it's certainly not outside the realm of what is already happening in those Tatyova lists. And I think that this is an inclusion that can be very explosive.
Right. In moving to...
I don't know if Pongo wanted to add on it.
Oh, yeah.
Anything
Sorry.
like that.
Oh, no. I think that covers it. That certainly hadn't considered all of those possible options.
I know on this last card, I know Pongo has some thoughts specifically, especially because you are kind of some of the Bant like Godfather, right? With all the what's the Derevi list that you've done, is Livio Oathsworn Sentinel. That is a new partner commander with white that is 1 colorless and a white, legendary human knight. It's 2/2. Has an ability that is colorless and a white, does not require it to tap. Choose another target creature. Its controller may exile it with an Aegis counter.
Aegis, yeah.
Okay. Aegis counter on it. And then it has a second ability that is 2 colorless and a white. It requires to tap it. Return all exiled cards with Aegis counters on them to the battlefield under their owner's control. So you were kind of talking about doing this with Thrasios and kind of doing some infinite mana things. Kind of explain the thought process with that.
Yeah, so I think both Cobble and I have a special place in our heart for Derevi.
This is true.
we both go way back with Derevi and have a special relationship with her and that deck. But yeah, so the way I've heard discussions surrounding this card, and I think it's a super intriguing card for a lot of reasons. I don't want to necessarily get into all of them because I think that could be a very long conversation in and of itself. But essentially, this represents a new option for Bant using Thrasios, and theoretically, you could even play this in kind of like a Hate Bearsy type of shell. So the idea here is, Thrasios is obviously your infinite mana outlet. How are you getting infinite mana? Well, Livio actually can contribute to that in a meaningful way. What you do is you exile something like a Great Oak Guardian or a Village Bellringer. Then you use Livio's other ability, so you tap him and pay 3 to return your Great Oak Guardian or Village Bellringer to play. And ideally, for this to really work, you need to have mana dorks in play that will generate enough mana so that you're going to net mana every time you're untapping. So you need to make 4 mana with your dorks, and you need to be able to make double white. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it's certainly possible to do. Things like Bloom Tender certainly go a long way toward that. Things like Faber Welter certainly go a long way toward that. And obviously you can do other things to combo with all of those cards, Great Oak Guardian and Village Bellringer, things that will return them to your hand, like a Temur Sabertooth type of situation. Hate Bears in particular are interesting because Livio lets you kind of selectively remove the hate pieces that might actually be preventing you from winning. Let's say, you have like a creature that's a rule of law effect in play, like an Eidolon of Rhetoric. You just kind of temporarily put it into exile, do your thing, and win from that position. So there's some play even with those really powerful hate pieces. And notably, Livio lets you exile cards, and because they have the counters on them, there's nothing that actually says that if Livio dies, those cards are gone forever. You can replay Livio and bring those cards back. So,
that was a very thoughtful way to design it, and I am grateful to whoever it is that did that design, because that lends some insight into the I would say the floor cases of this type of pattern,
right?
And how this is able to transcend some of those floor cases because of that.
Yeah, I think he's incredibly intriguing, and he's one of those cards that kind of, and I mean, I said I didn't want to get into this, but I guess I'm getting into it a little bit. He's a card that kind of makes me think of one of the tensions that exists in white as a color, which is that white has this simultaneous identity of playing lots of little creatures, but also having mid-rangey cards like board wipes and stuff like that. And those two game plans are in like, they have extreme tension with one another. But here we have a bear who lets you tuck everything away, wipe the board, and then you can start bringing it all back in. So he kind of actually starts to address that tension that is, to me, existed for a very long time in white's part of the color pie. So I think that the card is really, really cool. I wish that first ability only cost 1 white mana. I'm not entirely sure why you have to pay 2 mana to exile your thing and then have to pay 3 mana later to bring it back. Especially when it's a May ability, so you can't just use it as repeated removal on opponents' creatures.
How much does Hellvault cost?
Too much.
Hellvault, I'd have to look that up, but I don't remember it being that much mana to actually use. Yeah, it's 1 mana to exile target creature you control.
I thought it was 1 mana.
1 mana and tap.
Okay. But still,
in either case, this is a white card, right? So it's not an artifact that any color has access to. This is kind of like white's thing is like flickering things, or not bouncing things, but fast flickering them, even exiling things, and hopefully this represents a direction that Wizards is willing to go into to expand white's part of the color pie. Because this also represents a way to, double up on enter the battlefield effects, which can in itself be a form of card advantage.
That's right.
So this is an intriguing card.
This is a way you can get your monarch back when somebody takes your monarch away from you.
Yes, exactly. And I think we were talking about that before, about how monarch is also one of those mechanics that I would love to see white having much more of, because to me at least, it's a very flavorful way to address sort of this issue of card advantage in mono white. I think Livio is, like I said, a super, super interesting card. People have kind of glossed over him because he's not going to be busted in cEDH. That much is clear, but he represents something really interesting for white. That I hope we kind of see explored in perhaps a slightly more pushed way in the future.
Yeah.
I think he's an incremental evolutionary step of what white can be. And this isn't it, but it's indicative of the trajectory that they're maybe thinking, in which case it might eventually become it.
Right. So many cards this time around that, if they were just 1 mana less here or there in white, could actually be, cEDH worthy and, very, very strong cards. Unfortunately, going through this list, I think this might be the only white card we actually discussed. Which just goes to show that, while the intention is there and a lot of the cards are certainly powerful, the issue is that they lack, I think, the efficiency to be relevant for cEDH in a lot of cases.
And we talk about white in this set, and we could honestly just do a whole video, the three of us talking about white and the problems with it and all that. But I said this before we went on, is I look at a card like Armored Skyhunter, which, if you're not familiar with that, is 3 in a white creature. That whenever it attacks, you look at the top 6 cards of your library, put an enchantment card from them on the battlefield. And there's other parts to that. But it's very evocative of a card like Collected Company. And it's clearly trying to be in that same vein. The problem is a card like Collected Company does something immediately, right? You get your card and you put it onto the battlefield, your cards. The problem with this is it takes a turn cycle to do anything. And And that turn cycle is very important. And I mean, honestly, I was talking to Phoenix about this. If this card says, whenever this enters the battlefield or attacks, I think we could start to talk about this card as being a worthy include in some things.
Give it Titan templating.
Right. But the problem is that because of the templating of this, it pulls very strongly the power level of this card way back, and it holds it back from being good. And this is a format where they're clearly not afraid to print into Commander stuff that is really powerful, right? Like they printed Opposition Agent, they printed Hull Breacher, they printed Jeweled Lotus. They're not afraid. But there's something there with their design mentality with white that is holding it back from being really, really good.
Yeah. Cobble, you look like you wanted to say something.
I mean, I wanted to say something. I just don't know if anything good was going to come out. I mean, I would love to see more things like Elish Norn, or more things like Sanctum Prelate, right. And but what we seem to get is we get things that are something that's way in between those two extremes, and it's something that's just very milquetoast and very non-impactful for what's happening on the board. I mean,
or we end up with stuff like a Chroma, which is just,
So, okay, for what it's worth, a Chroma is really powerful in Battle Cruiser cEDH or Battle Cruiser EDH. Right. If everyone's playing slow, kind of the mainline core EDH demographic, that card is really good.
Even there were still a portion of those people who were large in the casual EDH, Battle Cruiser type community, who were going, this is 7 mana. This is a lot of mana. And I get what you're saying. I think you're right, but I also we're talking about like stuff like Triumphant Reckoning that's like 9 mana, or Soul of Eternity that its power and toughness are equal to your life total and it's 7 mana. That's terrible. And the thing, and it's so frustrating for me because honestly, every time I look at Armored Skyhunter, I get mad because it's so close to being good. It's so close to being good. And it's frustrating for me because I see them printing stuff like Uro. That is right there. It's pushed. It's really good. I see them printing stuff like Hull Breacher, like
Dockside Extortion,
all these things, and then I see them just fumble on the 1 yard line with Armored Skyhunter, and they're right there, and they can't figure it out, and that's just, it's frustrating for me because I love white, and to see it be kind of handicapped like this very intentionally is frustrating.
I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I do agree. I would certainly like to see some stronger white cards. However, at the same time, I'm okay with white not being like the best cEDH color, or never being like a particularly amazing cEDH color. This game is bigger than just cEDH, and I think that occupying a part of the game that makes makes white as a color perhaps really strong in other formats, but doesn't necessarily play to what is really strong or what is sort of a need in competitive EDH, to me is okay. That being said, I still want more diversity in the format, and I would love to see people feeling like, okay, I have a reason to play white. So we certainly do need some stronger cards in white, but from my perspective, I'm okay with it never being, like core, like perhaps like Grixis or Sultai are.
I for me just mostly want it, and maybe I'm biased because I do a lot of work with Lavinia. So any new good white card, I'm immediately jumping on. But the big thing for me that I see with it is I just want the quality of both sides of my color in a deck like Lavinia to be good. You know what I mean? Because in Lavinia, realistically, it's a blue deck, right? That has a handful of white cards within it. And that's very frustrating because there's certainly a merit to white and there is a need for white. And I think that it can service those things just so long as Wizards is willing to, push it just a little bit. I don't need it. Listen, I don't need it to be opposition agent good. I just need them to push it just a little bit. Give it a little push off the edge.
Make it Draneth Magistrate good.
Yeah, that was that was amazing. It was amazing. But I'll tell you what, we've been recording for 3 hours. We have covered a ton of ground and really talked about a lot of different things in, cEDH and what we think might be coming. And honestly, first of all, thank you guys for joining me again. I know we all love making this content, but again, I always want you to know I appreciate you being down to do this with me. But so, do you guys have any final thoughts about Commander before we really, jump off? Commander Legends, I should say.
I was going to say Commander in general. Well,
I know I worded that strangely.
Maybe another episode. Yeah.
I think that Commander Legends, I think it delivered what we expected.
Yeah.
We heard that there was going to be 71 new partners, and I think a lot of people went, whoa, that's going to change the metagame. And people, kind of came back and said, well, they're not going to be cEDH. And people said, no. With that many new partners, you're gonna hit on a couple of them for sure. And I think that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a good number of new partners that are going to diversify the lists that people are playing, and not just, yes, we do see a number of new lists that are going to be kind of, well, the good things that Grixis does just with these commanders, or the good things that Grixis does with those commanders, or the good things that Mardu does with these commanders, that kind of thing. Yes, that's a thing, but there's also some new, suicide Final Fortune stuff with Obeku or Ubeka or whatever,
right.
And Krark, and there's new styles of gameplay that are also being engendered in some of these cards, and I am excited to see the way that those things change play and see how people get better about playing tutors because opposition agent exists and stuff like that. So I'm excited. I am looking forward to see the changes that take place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and from my end, I echo everything Cobble just said. Additionally, I'm legitimately impressed by this set. Obviously going into it, there's some anxiety about, what is the broken thing that Wizards going to print that, ruins the format for us. I don't know that actually happened. I think Opposition Agent is certainly going to warp the format, but it's a card that has counterplay, and it's not really pushing us in directions that we already weren't being pushed in by,
right.
A whole list of other reasons. Additionally, one of the things that Wizards seems to have been able to do really, really well, and I commend them for this, is what I call sort of like horizontal card designs, horizontal power level, which is, they printed a bunch of new commanders that are very powerful, but they're not completely pushing out other options out of the format. Right. They're coexisting with commanders that have existed previously. They're not just doing, they're not Corvold, where they're essentially saying,
right.
forget playing any other Jund commander for a while,
right.
Because this just does everything that you want in Jund, and it does it better. Right. Just essentially lots of new ideas, lots of new decks that can be built, and each of them has their own flavor.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm really excited to get brewing. I pre-ordered my box of Commander Legends, and I'm hoping I can buy more Commander Legends boxes.
You have chosen wisely. I think the EV for this set is
bananas,
unbelievable.
So yeah, over $200 a box right now, but it'll go down.
This set in Double Masters, I bought 5 boxes of Double Masters off my 1 box of Double Masters.
Wow.
Yeah, I just to be fair, I had an unbelievable box of Double Masters. So
it sounds like it.
Yeah. But with that being said, we're super excited. We've got some fun Commander content lined up for you guys as the wait for Commander Legends rolls nearer and the release comes up closer. So we will be coming at you next time. And with that, I'm Callahan.
I'm Cobble.
And I'm Pongo.
We'll see you next time.
Have a good one.